All right, so here we are, day 2 in rhetoric, and hopefully you were able to complete the assigned reading from first day, reading the preface and introduction, pages 1 to 6, and reading the speeches in Appendix A, pages 331 to 363. So this was for January 4. For today, I'm just checking my schedule here to make sure I got this right. Okay, so we want to read pages 9 through 14, which will be lesson 1 in your student textbook, and then complete exercise 1, which is pages 1 and 2 in your workbook. Okay, so just something of an overview of that information. Lesson 1 is titled A Christian View of Rhetoric. And the author is going to spend some time here defining rhetoric, and that's a great way to start. And we've already started using our Webster's 1828. We're going to continue that here in just a moment. Anyway, so the author's going to answer the question, what is rhetoric, by defining it. And then he's going to look at each part of that definition. What makes something effective. And he's going to delve into Scripture, particularly Proverbs 10, 19 through 21. He's going to look at that carefully. The idea of a word fitly spoken from the book of Proverbs. And I thought that was like his, fitting words. I guess that's fitting words. That's the title of his text. And I'm pretty sure he takes that from Proverbs. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. And so he's going to look at several scripture passages and how they relate. Then in your workbook, you're going to find the questions, I think, that are on page 13. Maybe not. He has some thinking deeper questions on page 13. I thought those were what he used in his workbook, but maybe not. But those thinking deeper questions, don't ignore them. Read them and think about them. And it may be that along the way, I will start including some discussion of those questions in what I'm presenting. Proverbs 25:11 is a verse to memorize. And then in your workbook on page 1, name and explain 3 distinct things a speaker can do to make his speech ineffective. Find 3 passages not referenced in the lesson where the Bible speaks about how we should speak. 1 from Proverbs, 1 from Jesus in the Gospels, a 3rd from elsewhere in the New Testament. Draw 1 practical application for rhetoric from each. Okay? So you're not going to duplicate verses that he's used in the chapter. So you're going to find your own verses, and for each verse, apply it to rhetoric. Specifically, apply to rhetoric in the idea of how to be effective in our speaking. Number 2 says, find 3 passages not referenced in the lesson where the Bible speaks about how we should speak. Oh, well, that's... What? Okay, so his second question is actually included in his first question. So the first question is really name and explain 3 distinct things a speaker can do to make his speech ineffective. That's question 1. Question 2 is finding the passages and drawing one practical application for rhetoric from each. For some reason, question 2 got included, at least in my workbook. Question 2 is included in the text of question 1. So question 1 is name and explain 3 distinct things a speaker can do to make his speech ineffective. You're either going to find those in the chapter, those things, or you're going to derive those things from what the chapter speaks about, because I think the author's going to focus on what it means for us to have effective speech. So obviously what's ineffective would not be doing those things, right? But don't say it in terms of, like if he says enunciating makes speech effective, right? Don't say not enunciating. Don't negative what he says. Positively identify the opposite, right? If enunciating is a good thing, then what's the opposite of enunciating? That would be, say, mumbling, right? Okay. And then for number 2, you're going to find those passages in Scripture that it asks for. Okay. So there's your reading and your assignment that you will be submitting. Okay. All right. So I want to pick up where we left off in defining. Remember that we defined rhetoric from Webster's 1828. I talked about it some, and we identified some key words here. And then we went on and defined the different forms of or words built upon the base word rhetoric: rhetorical, rhetorically, rhetoricate, rhetorication, rhetorician, rhetorize. Okay? And so this is how we get started in doing research on a particular discipline. So at this point, we want to continue, and let's start defining some key words here. So we'll just start right here, and let's define the word art. Okay? So I would start, hopefully all of this information fit on one page, or maybe it was 2 pages, whatever the case. But let's start a new page, and on the top line, centered for a heading, we're going to put rhetoric. I'm going to put a colon, and we're going to put key words. What that means is, from the definition of rhetoric, we're pulling out key words that we want to define. Now, some of these, I may have identified a word, and we might think, after we define it, well, maybe that word wasn't as key as we thought. And that's okay. Okay, so the first word that we come to, that we've underlined, is art. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the most important keyword. It's just the first one that we underlined, right? Number 1 right here. Art. Okay, so let's go ahead and put down art. Now it's at this point, whereas with those initial definitions, I was writing out the entire definition. It's here that I'm going to be more particular in what definition and what parts of definitions I use, because these are words, we want them as they relate to rhetoric, okay, in this case. So art. The first entry I see for art says the second person indicative mode, present tense, of the substantive verb am, but from were. So, how great thou art. Okay, well, that's not what we want. Then there's art, the noun, and it gives me it comes from the Latin ars, artis, probably contracted from the root of Welsh, The radical sense is strength, from stretching, straining. The primary sense of strength and power, and hence of skill. Right? So it seems that this word in its etymology derives from the idea of a particular skill. Definition 1 says the disposition or modification of things by human skill to answer the purpose intended. In this sense, art stands opposed to nature. Well, that's interesting, but I don't think is particular to or directly applies to our circumstance. Definition number 2 says a system of rules serving to facilitate the performance of certain actions. Right. So now this sounds like what we want to be interested in here in definition number 2, because that when it says to facilitate the performance of certain actions, remember, rhetoric has to do with speaking, right? It's the art of speaking, and so that's a certain action, isn't it? So this would seem to be the most applicable here. So let's get this down. Number 2, I put number 2 so that I know this is definition number 2. A system, we should have put a little N here for noun. The word's not art, and it's art and noun. Maybe my comma helps a little bit there. A system of rules serving to facilitate the performance, so to facilitate the performance of certain actions. I have to be really careful. Whenever I write the letter I, the next thing I go to write, it wants to connect it for some reason. Certain actions, and we're going to put a semicolon here, and then he says opposed to science. So that's interesting. Opposed to science. Or to speculative principles. Whoops, not principals. Let's get the right principles here. Principles. Okay, so this is interesting. He says opposed to science, and I don't think that we should think that by that he means opposed in the sense of being antagonistic or against, as though art is an enemy of science. Okay? In fact, I think what we're going to do is we're going to underline the word science, and we're going to get that definition below our definition of art, because I think it's important, this phrase, opposed to science. But notice that we're talking about art, and we're talking about the practice of something, and that there's a system of rules for the practice of something. In fact, now what we haven't written down about his definition, he goes on to say this. Arts are divided into useful or mechanic and liberal or polite. You may have heard of liberal arts. Some universities or colleges are called liberal arts college. That means that across the spectrum, they try to introduce the student to subjects across the spectrum, and it's not a like a trade school that is focused on, they have trade schools for auto mechanics or whatever it is, and that's not a liberal arts school because it focuses in on that specific art. Okay. Now, so he's divided into useful, mechanic, that's two names for the same kind. Liberal, polite, that's two names for the same kind. All right, so there's two kinds: useful, liberal, mechanic, or polite. The mechanic arts are those in which the hands and body are more concerned than the mind, as in making clothes and utensils, right? So my auto mechanics, that would be a mechanic art, a useful art, right? You think about carpentry and such. Now, it doesn't mean that the mind's not involved, okay? But when you think about an auto mechanic, you think about somebody who works with his hands, right? But I'm sure his mind is involved, and there's, as we come to find out, there's a lot of thinking about things that has to go into that kind of trade. In fact, Webster says these arts, referring to the mechanic arts, are called trades. Then he says this: the liberal or polite arts are those in which the mind or imagination is chiefly concerned, as poetry, music, and painting. Okay, so clearly with painting or music, the hands are largely involved in that, but the imagination, because oftentimes people are painting, or the music that they produce, or the poetry that they write, comes out of the mind or the imagination. The third definition says skill, dexterity, or the power of performing certain actions acquired by experience, study, or observation, as a man has the art of managing his business to advantage. And so actually that definition number 3 is somewhat applicable. So let's write that one down. Definition number 3: skill, dexterity, or the power of performing certain actions, in our case, actions of speech, right? He's a skilled speaker, right? Dexterity, we often think of dexterity as manipulating our fingers and hands and such, but the word dexterity is sometimes used to describe a person's thinking, his dexterity in thought, the ability to turn your thinking particular directions, especially in response to what someone else is saying or to circumstances, or the power of performing certain actions. We had that in the second definition here, to facilitate the performance of certain actions, right? So the power of performing certain actions, and then a comma, acquired by experience, study, or observation. Okay, so Clearly here in this class, we're going to be acquiring, hopefully, some skill, some dexterity, some power performing rhetoric by study. Perhaps by observation, we'll see. We might have some video clips to observe rhetoric, speaking. Okay, so, all right. Now, looking at these definitions, it could well be that, and you can see how this research can get quite extensive, because I call this our level 1 words, because level 1 are those words we define out of the definition, the original definition, or the initial definition. Now, as I underline particular words here, this would be getting to level 2, right? Skill, dexterity, okay? Those are qualities of which we might be interested in, okay? Now, I said that we wanted to, I'll go ahead and keep this same pen color. We wanted to define this term science because Webster has made this statement here, opposed to science, right? So let's see if we can confirm whether it's opposed in the sense of being opposite to, right? Like, is it opposite in the sense of one's good and one's evil? Or just what is the nature of that opposing? And I think we can find this as we define the word science. Okay, so the word science comes from the Latin. It means to know. And the first definition that Webster gives is, in a general sense, so my E got a little separated there, but that's all right. Knowledge. This is interesting. He says knowledge, and then he has comma, or certain knowledge. And then he goes on in that first definition. The comprehension or understanding of truth or facts by the mind. He then says the science of God must be perfect. Now, in his second definition, he says, in philosophy, a collection of general principles or leading truths relating to any subject. Pure science, as the mathematics, is built on self-evident truths. But the term science is also applied to other subjects founded on generally acknowledged truths, as metaphysics, or on experiment and observation, as chemistry and natural philosophy, or even to an assemblage of the general principles of an art, as the science of agriculture, the science of navigation. Arts relate to practice. Okay. Now, so that's where we get this idea that an art is a practice of something, And there's a connection between science and art. So when he says opposed to science, why does he say that? Well, he says it's opposed to science in the sense that it is other than science. Right? So the word opposed here, he might actually mean more distinct. Okay? But he does have a quote here, and I want to write this quote down. He says that he has this quote: a principle in science is a rule in art. So remember, art is a system of rules, okay? Well, those rules are built on principles, okay? And those principles are the leading truths that we come to through the science of a subject, the knowledge, the understanding, the comprehension of a subject, okay? That's what I'm getting out of our definitions here. One last thing that Webster has in his definition of science, at the end of his definitions, he has in parentheses, note, authors have not always been careful to use the terms art and science with due discrimination and precision. Music is an art as well as a science. I would suggest you could also say rhetoric is an art as well as a science. But he says music is an art as well as a science. Then he says this: in general, an art is that which depends on practice or performance. Right? Again, an art, in fact, this is good enough that we should write this down, because it relates to our definition of art and how it compares to science. An art is that which depends on practice or performance. He goes on to say, a science, that which depends on abstract or speculative principles. Okay. So we'll say science is that which depends on abstract or speculative principles. Then he says this: the theory of music is a science, the practice of music is an art. Right? So the theory, I would think we could say, the theory of rhetoric is a science. The practice of rhetoric is an art. Right? So notice in our definition of art, it said opposed to science or to speculative principles, right? And that's what we're seeing as he defines science as well, that science is built on speculative principles. Art is built on practice and performance. So I'm looking up the word opposed. Set in opposition, resisted, being in opposition in principle or in act, adverse, opposition, situations so as to front something else, a stand over against, right? So contrariety or diversity of meaning as one term used in opposition to another. Okay, so see, now that I think starts to get to how he's using this opposed, right? It's not he's using opposed as we would think in terms of the act of opposing, in the idea that I need to defeat my opponent here. No, it's a being used in opposition. It's a diversity of meaning. You see, art again being the practice, science being the abstract, the speculative, the theory. Okay, so when you think about music, right, when you listen to the music and you hear the music being played, that's the art of it, that's the practice of it, and it's got its own system of rules. But those system of rules in the art are certainly going to be related to the principles that were followed in order to write the music that's being played, the science behind the art. Okay, I hope that makes some sense. It's an interesting distinction. It's clearly a distinction that Webster makes in his defining of his terms, art and science. And so with our rhetoric, remember when we defined rhetoric, where was that? Rhetorical, containing the rules of rhetoric. Now I put science there, but see, that's probably, I perhaps shouldn't have done that, because art is a system of rules. What is science? Science is the speculative, abstract or speculative principles from which those rules of the art come forth, right? Okay, so we're getting some more clarity here in exactly what it is we're talking about and the various aspects of it, right? So rhetoric is not, it's not just speaking, right? There is an art and a science to it. And hopefully both of those things we'll start to see explained as we continue through our text. Okay, so that's the defining work that we're going to do today. You may feel like, well, we didn't do very much. Well, that's the nature of this kind of research. We'll continue with this again. I may not have a recorded session every time we have every day, but you certainly will have work to do from your text and your workbook potentially each day. So remember, today you want to read pages 9 through 14. That's lesson 1. And then you want to complete exercise 1, pages 1 and 2. Okay?